all come to the microphone and you're all quiet. Very good. We're so happy you're here. We have a wonderful program again for you. Felicia Kotis is one of our finest archivists. I think we have 5 or 6 now. And we're real fortunate that she has gotten this program ready for you. Anyway, we're glad you're here. The bathrooms are in the back. Please get up, feel free to get up anytime. Cell phones, we have a new rule now that if your cell phone goes off, your donation is accepted of $10. This is probably not a very good one. Those people who have hearing issues, we like you to sit in the front. But since we have those really nice red chairs in the back, I don't think that's going to happen. We encourage you to join, volunteer, artist, and Carol at the door there. We don't have membership forms because we're redoing them. They will be happy to take your name, and then when we get our forms, we'll mail one to you. Also, we have a lot of need for volunteers. This is partially why we did this program. Archivists are definitely needed. We have a trove of wonderful things below the building that we're in, and we need people to help sort those things out and categorize them and record them for future generations. We have, I believe Cindy is, do we have home tour tickets to sell today?
Yes.
I think so.
Oh, very good. Francine and Jeannie are back there selling those. Is there a discount if they buy them today?
No. That's why it's called a fundraiser.
It is our prime fundraiser for the year of the Historical Society.
How much are they?
$20. It's a bargain. They take you all over town in nice vans, beautiful homes. You'll learn a lot of history of the area. The census table is also back there. Jeannie is on the census committee, which is coming up, the importance of it. We encourage you all to be in the historic 2020 census. We also have a surprise program. Ken Zoll, who is the president of the Verde Valley Archaeology Center, is going to do a special program this coming Sunday in this room at 3 o'clock on meteorites and the importance of meteorites in the Native American culture. And it's a free event. We won't have refreshments though, but we promise we'll have the red chairs out for those. Also, the Cottonwood Historical Society wants you to come to this month. The reason Ken is coming is because this month is Archaeology Month, the month of March. They're having a special program. The Tuzagoot Monument staff is going to do a special program on the last Friday, the 28th, at their museum there in Cottonwood at 1 o'clock. The day after that, so that's Friday, Saturday, the 29th, they're going to have their annual meeting. Again, all of these events are free and they welcome all of you to come. Now, we could never do this without our team. So I would like the team members to stand just briefly, and you can take a look at their faces, and if something goes wrong, go to one of those people. Please stand. Michael, Artist Carol, Jeannie, Francine. Edith is the co-chair of the First Fridays. She's responsible for all the refreshments. And our refreshments comes from a new place called Weibo's Restaurant, which used to be Charlotte's. So they give us a really good deal on the cookies, so please support them. Now, I would like to introduce Felicia Kotis, who's not only an outstanding archivist, but a wonderful person, and I think she will give you a lot of insight into what the secrets are in our museum.
All right, can everybody hear me? Yes. Good, excellent. Thank you, Ruth, for the introduction and the kind words. And I passed the first technical test of wearing this microphone. to Michael for helping me with that. So I'm part of the Clarkdale Museum's collection team. My name is Felicia Coates. And the other members of the collection team are Nathan here, who's sitting next to the tripod, and Ray, who's hiding in the back there. So we're a small but hardworking group, and so we thought that this might be something interesting to present to the group today. I had one request of the group here today, and that is if you could hold your questions until the end of the presentation. Also, if I suspect many of you may have information to add to the presentation, so I really welcome you. If you have information that I have not been able to capture in the presentation today, please, share that with the group. The other thing I wanted to share is that after I finish with my PowerPoint presentation, Ruth Wicks will come back up here and she will talk about these pieces here that she has spoken to me about donating to the museum, so you can kind of get a better understanding as to our museum's process for evaluating donations. So with that, I think I'll start. I can operate this. There we go. So this presentation is a take on the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum, which is a really wonderful program. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. My presentation will likely not be quite as sensational as theirs, because they describe their program as one in which extraordinary, often bizarre treasures housed in America's museums represent wondrous chapters in America's history, but a physical display can only tell part of their story, which is the whole reason I'm doing this presentation today. Behind each artifact are amazing tales and secrets to be revealed, and this is the sensational part. Tales sometimes brimming with scandal, mystery, murder, and intrigue. Scandal, mystery, and murder, I can't deliver today, sorry. In Mysteries at the Museum, this handsome guy over here, Don Wildman, who's very easy on the eyes, visits a wide variety of museums across the U.S., taking viewers on a sometimes shocking tour of America's past by re-examining what's been left behind. This program is dedicated to my friend Jesus, also known to many as Jess Valdez. He passed away a couple years ago, and he was a frequent visitor to the museum. He'd visit me on Sunday mornings, and he was one of the founders of the Clarkdale Museum, and he was a strong supporter of the museum. He donated many, many items. But I'm highlighting here in the context of this presentation because he believed so strongly that an object without a story to accompany it was meaningless. He would visit me at the museum, show me an item that he intended to donate, and then he would say, "Do you like it?" And I'd go, "Oh yeah, that's really cool." And he'd go, "Well, you can't have it yet." He'd say, "I have to write a story to go with it." And he did write stories to go with many things that he donated. Some things he didn't get around to, so I've got 5 boxes of stuff from him in the basement in the museum that I have to go through and try to put the puzzle pieces together of what he left behind. So, next slide is, so today's presentation will present you with these items here that are in the museum's collection, and importantly, the stories that accompany these objects to help bring them to life. So this first item was actually donated by Jess, and is a receipt book from the 1940s of the, and forgive my Spanish, of the Club Aeronautico Hispano, roughly translated as the Mexican Flying Club. This particular receipt is from 1941 and is for a fee of $6 paid by Raul Valdez, Jess's brother, for 4 hours of flying lessons. So this is the information that Jess provided to accompany this receipt book. He said that like everybody in 1940, Mexicans were very excited about airplanes. In 1941, despite a modest income, a group of Mexicans, many of whom worked for the Clarkdale smelter, formed an aeronautics club. Members paid fees toward airplane flying lessons, purchase of a Piper Club airplane, and construction of an airplane hangar. Fees paid ranged from $4 to almost $17, which is an incredible amount of money back in the day. And adjusted for inflation, $17 today would be about $300. Some members of this club actually were able to successfully solo, but many were called into service in World War II and were not able to. Jess told me that there was actually a woman who was part of the club, but the receipt book doesn't include a receipt from the lady. There are, I think, about 17 receipts, and the names on the receipts include people that I imagine relatives of these people may still live in the area today, so I'll mention their names, two of whom are Valdez. So Raul Valdez, who is one of Jess's brothers, Refugio Valdez, who was Jess's oldest brother who worked on the Verde Tunnel and Smelter Railroad, Otilio Rosas, Luis Martinez, Jose Guerrero, Francisco Razo, Jose Acosta, who was also the club secretary, Fernando Mosqueda, and Antonio Rosa. And the next couple of slides just show you a couple more of the receipts. This one is a little harder to see, but it's paid by Antonio Razo, $12.47 for instruction and a hangar. The next slide is from 1941. Fernando Mosqueda paid $12 for construction of a hangar. So in summary for this article, this simple little receipt book tells a story of the Mexican Flying Club that until its donation, we knew nothing about. So the next one is a totally different object and story. This image shows a steel ingot donated by George Olson, who was an analyst at ARC Labs in Phoenix. And it's inscribed down here with the words, forged 1030 carbon steel from Clarkdale Slag. And it has the names of the companies involved, Koppers, Sumac, and ARC Labs. Mr. Olson worked at ARC Labs. And he also donated some newspaper clippings to help round out the story, not just give us the steel ingot. And it says, Clarkdale Steel Mill's plan cost $15 million, copper slag to be used in project. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the area, this image shows the Clarkdale smelter complex. And over here is the large black mass of solidified smelter waste, which is referred to as slag. The Webb and Knapp Company acquired the rights to the slag pile, which was estimated in mass to be about 30 million tons of material. And they also acquired the copper smelter, which had been abandoned in the late 1950s. So late 1950s, if you know the area, you know what was going on at the time. The Clarkdale cement plant had been built, and in late 1959, the first load of cement was trucked to the Glen Canyon area to create the dam. You know, a lot of activity going on in Clarkdale at that time after a period of significant inactivity. Interestingly, analysis of the slag by ARC Labs, the lab that employed Mr. Olson, showed that the slag contained on average 33% iron, and the slag was projected to yield steel for 30 to 60 years. However, the slag also contains small amounts of copper, which would have to be removed as it interferes with the rolling of the bars of iron. I don't understand what that means, but technical people do, I'm sure. But Webb and Knapp enlisted the Coppers Company, the name that you saw on that steel ingot. And they had an iron smelting facility in Niagara Falls that could extract iron from slag material. So you can imagine from the railroad here, several train car loads of slag were taken all the way to the Niagara Falls plant to conduct a pilot test for extraction of the steel. The test was successful. They were able to derive iron from the slag, and the ingot that you saw in the earlier slide was a product of that test. Based on the data from that pilot test, the Clarkdale steel plant was projected to produce 500 to 1,000 tons of steel a day. The plant was expected to employ 250 people, which at the time would have been about twice that of employment numbers at the cement plant. Webb and Knapp was quoted as saying, "In order to provide suitable accommodations for employees of the Clarkdale steel plant, Webb and Knapp has purchased virtually the entire town of Clarkdale from the estate of Earl Halliburton, who had bought the company town of Clarkdale in 1954. So Webb and Knapp acquired the smelter property for steel mill purposes for $1.4 million and the town of Clarkdale for $1.5 million. So unfortunately, as many of you know, the town of Clarkdale passed through many hands in the 50s. So Webb and Knapp was well on its way to creating a second major industry in Clarkdale, but ultimately two factors led to the demise of the plant. First, the cost of electric power in Arizona was prohibitively high. And second, there was no suitable grade of coal in Arizona. It would need to have been trucked in or brought in by train, and apparently that was too expensive. So this put the kibosh on the whole enterprise. Everything came to a full stop. Mr. Olson also donated a book like this, a written report of the economic analysis that led to this conclusion, as well as the technical feasibility for how you recover iron from slag. And it's really an impressive analysis and report. Whereas earlier reports indicated there was enough iron in the slag to yield steel for 30 to 60 years, the final report indicated the slag from the proposed steel plant would yield an annual production of 105,000 tons of rolled steel for 90 to 100 years. I found it interesting that Bill Zeckendorf, who was the president of Webb and Knapp, had been quoted as saying, "Man has been trying to reclaim on copper slag since the Bronze Age," which just illustrates how challenging the process is. And still today, we have companies trying to extract the precious materials from that slag pile. So the saga continues. So once again, these donations from Mr. Olson share with us a chapter of Clarkdale history that was little known. Can you imagine what Clarkdale would be like today had this venture gone forward? It's hard to imagine. Okay, switching gears again. These are branding irons donated by John Tavasi. The CD stands for Clarkdale Dairy, and these brands are said, or Mr. Tavasi said that they were one of the first brands registered in the state of Arizona. And this slide provides the history of the dairy as told by Mr. Tavasi. Senator Clark, who many of you know was the creator of the United Verde Copper Company and later the town of Clarkdale, decided his workers needed fresh milk. Dairies began in various locations, one of the first being a dairy in the Gulch of Jerome, operated by the Mickle family, who still lives in the area. The Tavasis started their dairy operation a bit later. For most of its operation, The Clarkdale Dairy was located to the north of Tuzagoot in the vicinity of Peck's Lake and in the vicinity of the marshy area that you can see when you look from Tuzagoot down today. The donor's father, Paul Tabassi Sr., was a native of northern Italy, immigrating to central Arizona in 1924. Paul initially worked for the United Verde Copper Company in Jerome. In 1928, Paul Tabassi and his wife became partners with other Italians who they knew in Jerome to come together to create the dairy. These Italians were, and growing up in a town full of Italians, I can say these names, the Federicis, Villaborghis, Resumicos, Veretos, Sofretos, Pozzobonis, and Marianis. My town where I grew up was a mushroom farming community, and for some reason Italians are big into mushrooms in dark places. I don't know. The Italians likely had their own enclave in Jerome, as John Tabassi Sr. said that he only spoke Italian when he started grade school. The Italians leased the land from the copper company and used the land as a dairy, a farm to raise feed, and a cattle ranch. So this is Mary and her husband Paul with the two boys, Paul and John, who you see on horseback here. And for those of you who are from the area, you can probably recognize the hillside in the background there. By 1946, the last of the Italian connection of partners sold out to Paul and Mary Tabassi. Many moved on to create other dairies. For those of you familiar with the area, you knew what an abundance of dairies there were back in the day, and they were all operated by Italians. The Marianis, for example, moved to Cottonwood to work in the Verde District Dairy, and then later to establish the Prescott Dairy in Prescott. So I'll just do a little segue here. This is a picture of a Mariani relative, the tall lady on the left. And that's the Verde District Dairy building that's still there today on Frontero Lane in Cottonwood. And it's been converted to a residence, but it was on the Cottonwood home tour 2 or 3 years ago. So just an interesting aside. These are images of the dairy in about 1930, and you probably can't see it, but on the side here there are panels which say Clarkdale Dairy on the delivery wagons. The work was hard and the days were long. The cows were milked by hand, and the milk was bottled in glass and delivered door to door daily. So you can see the delivery trucks and the men in suit, in a shirt and tie, getting ready to deliver the milk. But apparently the old man, Paul Sr., was not very keen on modernization. So when Paul Sr. went to Italy in 1952 to visit family, the boys took the opportunity to modernize the operation. So they're like, forget this milking stuff. They added electric milkers that piped milk directly to a homogenizer. Unfortunately, for those of you who know the history of the area, right about that time was when the mine and smelter here in Clarkdale closed, and the demand for milk obviously dropped sharply because people moved to Ajo and other places. So what the brothers did, and the old man, was they adjusted by purchasing a refrigerated tank truck, and they hauled the milk all the way to the Phoenix Carnation plant for several years until 1960. And at that time in 1960, Paul and John sold the milk cows and the equipment, but that wasn't the end. They ran a cattle ranch for almost another 30-some years, till June of 1991, when the Phelps Dodge Mining Company, who owned the land, so keep in mind, a lot of property in this area was not owned by people, it was leased. Phelps Dodge terminated the lease with the Tabassis. So these branding irons tell the story of a hard-working immigrant family who provided a very important service to the community. John Tavasi, besides working the dairy and the ranch, contributed many volunteer hours and dollars to his community. So I end this particular segment with the next slide, a charming poem on the side of one of the Clarkdale dairy bottles. Once I met a beautiful girl whose skin was like silk, for every day beside her plate was a glass of Clarkdale milk. Isn't that charming? All right, so now we go to something totally different. This is the next to the last one. This is a badge, and it's a little hard to see, but it says CVFD for Clarkdale Volunteer Fire Department, and it says tip top and then the number 3. So we got this donation, and the badge was found by George Banat Sr. when he was using a metal detector on 3rd North in Clarkdale. So it was buried, and he was able to uncover it and bring it to the museum. So when the museum received this donation, we wondered what tip top 3 meant. Fortunately, the museum had already received by separate donation a ledger containing minutes of the Clarkdale Volunteer Fire Department, starting with its founding meeting in May of 1913, so really early in the town's history. That ledger showed initially 2 companies, simply known as number 1 and number 2. But paging through the ledger, we came up with a page, and I don't expect you to try to read this, I'll tell you what it says. It mentions in May of 1916, so about 3 years later, the Tip Top number 3 fire company was established to service the Upper Clarkdale town site. Recall that construction of the town started in Lower Town initially in 1913, 1914. The minutes for this meeting covered bill payments, flushing of hydrants, greasing of the fire carts, and renewing pyrene, which I had to look up. I'm like, what is pyrene? Any firefighters here may know what that is, but it was the brand new at the time fire extinguishing liquid, carbon tetrachloride, which is no longer in use apparently. My favorite part of this page, however, is the vote to have a special meeting for the purpose of drinking and eating. The ledger goes on to provide other interesting insights into firefighting in that time period. For example, firefighters were categorized as nozzle men, hydrant men, and fire police. And also, there was a fire department for the smelter and a fire department with companies for the town. But the copper company had to grant permission for the volunteer firemen for the town site to leave their work site so that they could go fight the fires in town. Bureaucracy, right? So this next slide is an image, and it may be a little hard to see, but that's just the best image we have, is from the museum's collection and is of a fire that occurred probably prior to the existence of Tip Top Company number 3, but possibly at the time of companies 1 and 2. And it shows the destruction after a fire in December 1914 that burned what is labeled on the slide, on the photograph, as the early commercial district in Lower Town. So when the town was first constructed, there was a commercial district not up here, but in Lower Town. And what it says at the bottom is Miller Store, Post Office, and Bank of Arizona. And you can see instead in here is what we presume, it's not described clearly, but we presume to be the structures before the fire, and then this shows what it looked like after the fire. And I also think it's interesting because, you know, much of the construction of Clarkdale is solidly built, you know, with brick and mortar and so on, versus these structures, with the exception of this one solid wall that's still somewhat standing. These are all wood, and Cottonwood and Clarkdale and all the communities in the Verde Valley quickly learned that, you know, if you want your buildings to survive, you need to construct them of more durable materials. This image is also from the museum's collection and is of a fire signals placard, which may have been in place at the time of the lower Clarkdale Commercial District fire. It's undated, but we know it's early because it refers to the construction camp and tent town. In case of fire, someone would contact the powerhouse with the location of the fire. The powerhouse attendant would then use the main whistle to sound the alarm, which was one long blast followed by short blasts. And, you know, here it indicates the various parts of town: smelter site, construction camp, tent town, lower site, and upper site. And it tells you how many short blasts there were. So, for example, if there was a fire in tent town, it would be one long blast followed by 4 short blasts. So in summary, receipt of this donation by the museum led to an investigation of other related items held by the museum. Collectively, these items provide some interesting insight into the very early days of Clarkdale and firefighting. The ledger contains minutes of the CBFD, and it probably provides lots more interesting insights, especially if they were to be reviewed by someone who has a firefighting background. So if you know of anybody, let us know, because there's probably lots of good research that could be done on that ledger. So my final piece here is this Clarkdale Ice Company pick, which was donated by Pat Fairfield, a former Clarkdale resident and contributor to the community of Clarkdale. And there are 4 sides to it. So this side reads Clarkdale Ice Company. And then this side reads LC Wambacher Distributor. And then this one reads Ice Phone 195, Coal Phone 11. And then my favorite, which says, pick on the ice, not on the ice man. So somebody clearly had a sense of humor back then. So the ice plant is no longer standing, but here's a picture to show you the location of the ice plant. So the smelter is here, right? And you can tell this is early because there's only one single smokestack. And over here, that building is still standing. This is the old Miller Warehouse building. But over here is the ice plant. The original plant was built in 1914 at a cost of $25,000, which adjusted for inflation would be about $600,000 today. Clearly, this was an important building for the community, given its early construction in 1914. The freezer held 300-pound cakes of ice. In 1916, more capacity was needed, so just a couple years later, after its initial construction, a second unit was added, along with a house for the operator. And the operator in later years was a Mr. J.A. Son, S-O-N, who received an annual salary of $340, as well as housing and a helper. In the winter, this same crew provided coal to the town. This next image is a closer-in view of the ice plant, showing a spur line, rail line access to the plant. This illustrates some of the ice plant's insulation. This chunk of alternating layers of mortar and cork was discovered and identified by donor Paul Peck while exploring the ruins of the old ice plant. Paul is very good at roaming the surrounding area and finding stuff and bringing it into us. And here is an image of Effie Son, the wife of the proprietor, illustrating the clarity of the ice block. And here's something also from the museum's collection, which at first I'm like, I don't know, is it a game? I don't know. But I had to ask around. It's one of the ways when we get something, we're like, I Google it, I look for other things in the collection, I ask people who have lived here a long time, not me, I've only been here for 7 years, but I ask a lot of questions. And what I learned is that residents would place these placards in their window of their homes with the number at the top denoting how many pounds of ice they wanted. So ice was clearly critical for keeping food from spoiling. This image shows a schematic for how an ice box was used prior to modern day refrigerators. So the theory was you put your block of ice up here and your food down here, and the cold air would drop and the warm air from the food items would come up. So it was a circulation to keep things cool. But as you can imagine, in our environment here, they probably had to replace the ice block pretty frequently. So in summary, donation of this ice pick has led to a better understanding of the smelter town's infrastructure to support the needs of the town's residents and business owners. At this point, I think I'm going to do a couple things. One is I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions or any additions. And then when we're finished that, I want Ruth Wicks to come up here because she's got some things that we're going to talk about briefly. So first, any questions or additions to add to the stories, other insights to add?
I have one. Was the ice trucked in or was it harvested from the lake or something?
I don't know. Does anybody, Michael?
It was actually manufactured at the ice plant.
Was it?
Nice plant.
Good question.
Any idea how much a block of ice would cost?
I don't know. Does anybody who was around in that day have any recollection?
Well, the
Yes?
reason I asked the question is because my dad was from Illinois and he used to say that they go out in the lake or river or something and harvest ice.
Right. Up there, they could.
I've been told that in Flagstaff, you know, the lava tubes up there would have ice and they would harvest the ice from those lava tubes. That's no longer the case. Apparently things have warmed up or whatever. But they used to harvest some ice up in Flag, but to Michael's point, it was actually produced here. Yes?
We had a book of ice coupons that was found in an attic in Flagstaff, belonged to the Seiler family who were residents of Cottonwood. And they had, you'd buy a whole coupon book of tickets, and they'd be 10 cents, 5 cents, and 25 cents a ticket on ice tickets.
Very neat. Cindy?
Jerry Wambacher tells stories about the ice plant, and I've been down there for a long time too. And he said that's where all the kegs of beer were kept cold.
Yeah.
And then brought to different bars here. And if you go there on the platform, you can actually see the iron rings. And he knew everything about every square inch of that.
Yeah.
Jerry Wambacher's parents used to play cards with Jack's son and his wife. So Jerry's just been, he's so full of wonderful stories. I'm sorry he's not here today. But so a lot of these stories just trickle in through our old timers.
Yes?
Well, one thing missing from your little refrigerator thing is that ice did melt.
Yes.
And it would be collected in a pan at the bottom and
Yeah.
then be taken out and dumped. That's my
Yeah,
thought.
it said drain for melted ice. I guess there'd be a tray there or something. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions or additions? Yes,
Where
Bill?
was the commercial area in Lower Town?
Sorry?
Do we know where the commercial area was in Lower Town?
I don't know. The question was, does anybody know where the commercial district was in Lower Town?
I think it was just down there, just probably east of where the train depot is. I think that was just the hub for the construction workers. They needed a place to, deposit their money and buy a few things, and that's where all the development started in about 1913. So I guess I'm assuming
Well, my friend Jess would always tell me, look at landmarks. So, I mean, you can see the hillside where Hiawatha is, right? But it's still hard to tell exactly how close it is to that hillside.
So I think you're looking east
Yeah.
on that photo.
Yeah.
I think.
I think north.
East, north, yeah. Yes?
Where was the airstrip in Hayrick?
I wish I knew. I mean, there was a Clemenceau airport. You know, it was used by the cadets in World War II for training. They came and stayed at the, what is now the Cottonwood Clubhouse. They actually had their cots up on the stage there, and they stayed there, and they trained at the Clemenceau Airport, which is today the Cottonwood Airport. So that's my guess. Do you have any thoughts on that, Michael?
Yeah, that's the most likely site. There was another small airstrip that was also used for training purposes right out there at the intersection of Cornville Road and Mingus Avenue. The most likely scenario would be Clemenceau.
Yeah. I mean, one of the stories that I've heard told, and I don't know if it's accurate, is that the pilots would take off from Clemenceau Airport and do oval loops around the smelter smokestack here in Clarkdale. That was like a fun thing to see how fast they could do the loop. Bill?
In the reenactment that we do for the bank robbery, one of the characters is Wade Wiggins,
Yes,
who also had a dairy.
yes.
And so that's not an Italian name, so was there a story
He was-
there why there was a Wade Wiggins?
He was, well, it's not an Italian name, but I'm trying to remember. There was like, I think they were like Swiss, Italian, I don't know. There was some, yeah. Because they ran, the Wiggins family at some point ran what was known as the Swiss dairy over in the Bridgeport area. They started over here, but probably because of the smelter damage, you know, the smoke damage, a lot of dairies moved that way and kept moving until they got to Prescott or Sedona to get away from the smelter smoke. Yeah, good point. Any other? Okay, so Ruth, do you want to come up? So Ruth talked to me recently about some items that she had. You want to talk about what they are a little bit for the audience?
Yes.
Here.
My mother was raised in Hopewell and Jerome and fell in love with a young man when she was in high school. And they were going to be married, but then they got in a fight over window coverings or something. Of course, my mother probably wasn't the easiest woman to be around because she, as Cindy has indicated, beer was at the Ice House. Well, my mother went there at night with all her high school friends. Anyway, 50 years later, she met Ralph Dennison, which she had almost married, and he was a native son of Jerome. He was born and raised in Jerome. Well, he entered the Navy. He was, at that time, the mine had sent him to Los Angeles area to become a tool and die person. You know, there wasn't any aces around. So if you wanted a bolt or a screw or a nail, you had to make it. So that's the kind of business he was in, or skills that he had. So he was placed on a boat called the Vestal, and it's just recently been in the newspaper. This was Monday, February 17th. The survivor of the USS Arizona dies at 97. It goes on and says, this is Pearl Harbor. The vessel was parked right next to the Arizona. Ralph Dennison, my stepdad, went to the Battle of the Bands on USS Arizona the night before. That next morning, his friend said, "Oh, please go to church with us. It'll be R&R. You won't have to do anything." And Ralph said, "No, I'm going to stay here." And then he saw his friends on the wharf get killed, and the bombing started. Well, he was thrown back in the boat. I don't know all the terminology, and sort of, I think, had a concussion or something like that. When he had wakened, the captain was saying, all men overboard, all men overboard. Well, the first one off the boat was the captain, which they had to rescue because the water was just so terrible. I mean, with the bombs going off. And then the ensign, which is a person below the captain, said full steam ahead. So this boat, the Vestal, they rammed into a sandbar so it wouldn't sink. Well, meanwhile, they're right next to the big boat, the ship. Well, there are these men that have gotten trapped, and they can see them. So they throw a rope, or that people up there threw a rope, down to this boat, and 7 men were saved by the Vestal. And so this article is very good. It talks about one of the gentlemen that got rescued, so you will enjoy it or find it of interest. I don't know, joy. It's a good word. But over the years, a lot has been written about it. Well, a good friend who sits in the back here was a very good friend, Bob Belts, of Ralph Dennison. Bob Belts was not only in the Second World War through daylight missions into Berlin, and he attributes his ability to do that for the math teacher that was at the high school. And but he had such good math skills because he was the navigator. Anyway, Ralph and Mom came back here. The little house next to my house was their house. Ralph didn't have a lot of room. It's quite tiny. He asked Bob if he would like his toolbox. And I didn't know anything about it. And about a year and a half ago, Bob calls me up and says, I have Ralph's toolbox. Would you like it? And I said, well, yes, I would love it. So this toolbox was on the Vestal. And it has all his tools that he used, plus he has a book with his first projects that he did, first work details. One is a submachine gun. So I don't want to talk a whole lot longer. I mean, he has a lot of stories. Like he said, the worst part of it that they'd have to go out to the bay to get bodies. He said that was the worst duty, and they only had one gun on this boat. But they didn't know what was going to happen, so they got sandbags on the beach with this one rifle. And the password was Rob Roy, because Japanese people cannot say ours. Oh, he was full of stories, as was my mother. Anyway, so I thought this, Felicia was the one that wanted me to do this. I did not want to do it. So I thought, well, we'll put her through her paces as an archivist. So Felicia's going to tell us then what she would do if I would come in with this toolbox and handling it, open it up. I'll open it up for you so afterwards you can come and look at it. On that subject, all of these items are now on display at the museum. So right after the museum's open, right after this, you can go over there and see all the objects that have been talked about. Anyway, all right, Felicia, you're on.
So I don't have a lot to add other than Ruth approached me with this and told me a lot of the stories and what great stories she told me, and there's so much more. And having a father who was an engineer, I can kind of appreciate some of the tools that are in there. But people approach the museum a lot of times with wonderful artifacts, articles, items. And myself and other people at the museum will usually ask a series of questions relating to that article to better understand it, what it is. And one of the main things is basically questions relating to how does it relate to Clarkdale's history. Our building is kind of bursting at the seams right now in terms of place to store all the items that have been donated. So because of that, we have a policy that basically says what we will accept and what we won't. And so some of the criteria are that it has to relate to Clarkdale history in some way. So we actually have a geographic delineation of, we go as far as Sycamore Canyon to accept things like from the Alvarez Ranch, but we don't accept things that are from Cottonwood or from Jerome, because that wasn't always the case, but there are historical societies, museums that will take those items very gladly. So, we'll ask about that and just, ask for any other information to kind of understand, is there some way that this relates to Clarkdale? If it's not, we'll do our best to help people who would like to donate things to help them understand what other historical societies in the area or the state may want to accept their donation. Oh, and we're just going like this. So, some of the articles that may be donated are fragile, right? So old photographs, papers, newspapers, we get a lot of newspapers, and they're not in the best condition. So handling, we always encourage people to limit their handling of those articles because the oils from your fingers will penetrate the paper and will have a long-lasting effect. Anything else? Okay. So if you'd like to come up here and look at this and talk to Ruth more about history. Yes, you have a question?
So is this something you accept or not?
We would not.
Okay.
We would not, because, we do accept some things, we do have quite an extensive collection of people who were from Clarkdale who served in the wars around the world and had really any kind of military service. So we have their pictures, we have their biographies, and some information about their service. So, if Ralph Dennison were from Clarkdale, that would have made a difference. But he's not from Clarkdale, he's from Jerome.
And you suggested I possibly place this item in Pearl Harbor Museum?
So Ruth's question is, would we recommend approaching the Pearl Harbor Museum and asking if they would be interested in that? And so, yes, that would be something that we would suggest to people. Cindy?
Can you explain the form that we require people to fill
Yes.
out? And
Yeah.
maybe some of the requirements on that?
Yeah, so we have a form, and I know how much people love to fill out forms. But it's only at one side of one page, and it basically just, asks for your name, your contact information. But one of the most important things on there is your description of what it is you're donating, and consistent with this whole presentation is tell us a little bit about that. Like, how was it a part of your family's history? How is it a part of Clarkdale's history? Give us a little bit more. We have quite a number of items where, on its face, yes, we can tell the article is from Clarkdale, but we know nothing beyond that in terms of, how was it part of the family business or other aspects. So, only a few lines makes a world of difference to tell the story about that particular item. So, and if you want help, we can always write, you can tell us this history, we can write it for you on a piece of paper.
And the fact that it's irrevocable?
Yeah, so you can, we generally prefer not to take things on loan just because it's a huge responsibility for us. And we already have a lot of things to manage, to keep track of. And so keeping track of loan items that are not ours, it just presents a liability that we don't want to take on. So typically things that get donated, they're kind of labeled as unconditional donations, meaning that the museum can use them and for presentations, for archiving, to put on its website. Now, if there are some limitations, you can denote, for example, if you want the museum to have it and use it in a physical display, but you don't want that information put on the museum's website in the World Wide Web, you can limit that. There are other categories too, for example, for things that, there are a few categories where there are things that have been donated that perhaps aren't entirely germane to Clarkdale, and that you'd like to donate for the purpose of sale or selling by the museum to raise money for the museum, and we will accept those things. Sometimes we get people coming to the museum that aren't from the area, and they're we never will see them again, and they're kind of hard to contact. And it's really important that there's one place that says, if the museum decides that they do not want to accept the item, because it's not my decision, it's the decision of the board. If the board decides not to accept the item, do you want the article back, or would you just rather it be disposed of? Or do you want to donate it to another museum? So we can walk you through all of that. I don't mean to have it sound more complicated than it need be, but we're just trying to make sure that these articles are handled properly.
Let's send the volunteers to me.
Cindy, do you want to speak to that, or Michael?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
What kind of volunteers are you looking for?
We are looking for volunteers.
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck. We have several holes to fill on our board at this point, but volunteers we could use down in the archives. Still more, yes. We have the Town of Clarkdale collection that was given to us, and that is also in a position of being accession. So these are items that the Town of Clarkdale collected from early on. We have lots of record books, variety of things that go in that area. We need exhibit people to help us design exhibits. I would say that. We need someone to do some development of our financial, finance and development, that team that was with us.
Yes, it's just financial development, donors, grants.
Grant writing. Our strategic planning team meets once a month before our board meetings, and I'm sure you're tired of hearing about all that, but we have developed 8 teams. And so each team has a leader, and that's how we're able to do events like this, because we have teams that have really stepped forward to do a variety of things. So we have historic preservation, things coming up with the Town of Clarkdale. We need volunteers for that. Exhibit design and management, archival information, grant writers, CPA. Not that we can't necessarily pay anybody, but these are just outreaches into the community that will help us continue to grow. So talk to one of us, board members. Raise your hand if you're a board member.
Cindy, the other thing is, I think we have to let the volunteers know it's fun.
It is.
We like to have parties. We set aside the meeting every time to discuss food. So that's the big reason we want to have volunteers.
And the best part is we are getting more volunteers in the docent category. But the best part is that going to the museum, and I know all my volunteers will agree, you never know who's going to walk in the door that day, and the story they may have, or something that relates to the history of Clarkdale. It's sweet, it's a passion of mine, but you just get these connections to people, and that's what it's all about.
Don't forget actors and production help for the reenactment in the home tour.
I don't know, did you hear Bill say? Do you need more actors?
We need some extras, we need bank customers, we do have a couple actual actor roles available, and production help.
This is for the
But also
bank
the home
robbery.
tour needs lots of volunteers, so.
Right, this is the bank robbery reenactment that Bill's talking about, and home tour volunteers. So the home tour is coming up in April, so not far off. Okay, so thank you very much for coming.